Hello, everyone. I think it's time to start after waiting a bit. And I'd like to welcome everyone joining us all over the world. I think it's a quite global event. I'm Matheou. I'm the director of the Armenian Institute. And today is a super special event because I'm very, very excited to introduce my colleague, Dr. Nicholas Matheou, to start this amazing, exciting series on Ani. There's a bit of a tiny backstory to this. We run something called Armenian Studies Group at the Armenian Institute, where the scholars, academics, artists introduce their work, which is still in progress. And we thought Nick's work is in progress when he presented in March, I think. But once he finished his presentation, everyone unmuted themselves saying, can we have an event about this? And we started talking and all this happened. Nick will explain in more detail about what exactly is going to happen in July. But I'd like to introduce Nick properly. He's been our program manager and fundraiser since January. We've been very, very lucky to have him on our team. He joined us in the middle of a lockdown. So we were working with each other for about 4 or 5 months until we met in person, which was a quite surreal experience. And we're very pleased to discover that he's very tall because we are Armenian and we are all very short. So he's the only person at AI who can reach the top shelves. Except being tall, he has other achievements as well. He's a social historian and political activist. He's been educated in Edinburgh and Oxford, and his research focuses on medieval Middle East as seen through Armenian material. His research projects include a study and translation of the 11th century Armenian historian Aristakis Lastivertsi and the global history of the city of Ani, a big love of Nick's life. He'll talk about it now. And his activism focuses on social, political, and economic issues in Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East, particularly supporting and raising awareness about Kurdish freedom movement and multi-ethnic women and youth-led democracy in Northeast Syria. I have to add, except being an amazing scholar, a fantastic colleague, having a new job, Nick's very big achievement this year has been becoming a father of twins, 2 beautiful, beautiful babies. I had the privilege of holding them. I can tell you they're amazing. But I'll stop now. The meeting is being recorded. It's being live streamed on Facebook as well. And I know hundreds of more people will watch it after that. So welcome everyone to this. And you will have a chance to ask your questions to Nick after he finishes his presentation. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tato, for that lovely introduction. And thank you to everyone who's joined us today on the Zoom and everyone who's joining us via live stream and everyone who will be watching it when it gets uploaded onto YouTube afterwards. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be opening the series this month. It's a 4-part seminar series called Reintroducing the City of Ani, 900 to 2021. And it also launches a long-term collaboration between the Armenian Institute, our friends at the Association for the Protection of Cultural Heritage in Turkey, KMKD, as well as a transnational network of scholars who want to promote research, awareness and preservation of the city of Ani. And we're really open to, it's the very early days of this project. So we'd really like to hear from everyone who's interested in this project. Please do get in touch with myself at the Armenian Institute. That's Nick, N-I-K, at armenianinstitute.org.uk. And it's important to say that this series builds on and is dedicated to the work of Osman Kavala, who is a co-founder of KMKD, as well as other organizations promoting the heritage and reconciliation and dialogue between the peoples of Anatolia, Upper Mesopotamia and Caucasia. Osman Kavala has been imprisoned for 1,339 days now on spurious, politically motivated charges. And the organizations that he has helped to co-found have also been persecuted for the work that he's been doing. So we know that Osman Bey knows about our series and is very supportive of this initiative. So I'd like to dedicate not only this seminar, but the whole series to his work. So I'm going to share my screen with you now. My talk will be about an hour, and then we'll have time for questions afterwards, and we'll then finish around 8 o'clock UK time, so about an hour and 20 minutes, an hour and a half. So my own research on the city of Ani began when I visited the city in 2015 and fell in love with the incredible site, and the image that you see there is an image that I took on that first trip. And my interest peaked even further when, as Tato mentioned, for my PhD research, I was studying the 11th century history of Aristakes Lastivertsi. Aristakes' history is famous perhaps most for providing the first surviving account of the Battle of Manzikert or Malazgirt or Manazkert, the battle between the Eastern Roman, so-called Byzantine emperor, and the Seljuq Turkish sultan, which marks the beginning of the transformation of Anatolia from primarily Greek-speaking and Armenian-speaking and Roman-dominated space. And as part of his history, Aristakes uses a religious discourse to try and explain these dramatic changes that he saw. He was a Vardapet, a teacher of the independent Armenian church. And so this focuses on sin, but there are some quite concrete sins that he points to. And as part of it, he provides a series of vignettes of different saques of different events that take place. One of which is on the 1064 Seljuq Turkish sack of Ani. And there's this phrase that I found quite felicitous, where he says that this sack, this is the fate of unjust cities, built with the blood and sweat of the poor and the indigent. So after I finished my PhD research, I started focusing more on Ani, on social, political, and economic history, and I've taken this title, The Fate of Unjust Cities, as an emblematic, as the title and the emblem of the different story that I want to tell. And I say different story, and I use the phrase here in my title, reintroducing, because I think for many of us, if not all of us on this call and watching, we have quite a fixed story of Ani in our heads, with a fairly familiar set of characters, maybe an even over-familiar set of characters. It varies slightly depending on whether you've approached the city of Ani primarily through Armenian studies or through Georgian studies, but by and large, the image is of the Bagratuni kingdom, the Bagratuni monarchy, and its height in the late 10th and earlier 11th centuries. And the periods following, with the exception of the rule of the Zakarian Murha-Gudzeli family in the early 13th century, under the hegemony of the broader Georgian kingdom and its Pan-Caucasian empire, tends to fall away into the background. Ani has a long decline, whilst the earlier part is almost removed from history. And I have an image that I think kind of illustrates this very nicely. So you see there an image of Ani, almost Camelodian, almost like Arthurian in its iconography, which you see with these dancing figures down here, the joy of the Bagratuni kingdom in this imagining. You see Ani here with the lion that's over the lion gate, which is here. And this image is maybe sort of taken to the logical extreme, but emblematic of the way in which Ani is often taken outside of time and space. It's taken outside of its characteristics as a historical urban center that developed, because that's what all cities are. They are conglomerations of social relations between peoples, between animals, objects in a built environment that develop over time and within a given space. So this loss of Ani's historicity is something that I want to restore with the story that I want to tell today. And I think a good way of pointing to this is these kinds of composite reconstructions of Ani as a space. And just to say that our third series, seminar in the series by Helena Wattenpog is going to look at these kinds of representations of Ani and how it's been represented and seen. But you see here an early 20th century composite reconstruction, which demonstrates this loss of historicity, right? You see architecture that comes from this late 10th century moment and early 11th century moment, put alongside architecture that comes from the 13th century moment, and sat alongside each other as if they would have been seen in exactly the same way as on this image, without an understanding of dynamism and change. So I want to tell a new story to you today, and I want to tell this story to you from Ani's own stones, and that's a phrase that I'm going to come back to. But in beginning, I think it's important that we just orientate ourselves. So I know that maybe everyone on this call is very familiar with the exact situation of Ani, but it's important to just begin with the geographical, architectural, topographic context. So Ani, at least in its core site, sits just on the eastern edge of the modern Republic of Turkey, nearest to, at least in terms of the place you can access it from, nearest to the city of Kars, which is where you need to go to if you want to visit Ani today, and just along the Akhurian river, which marks the borders between the modern republics of Turkey and Armenia. And you can see that more clearly in this next image here. So this is the Akhurian river, comes down here. This is the Republic of Turkey, the Republic of Hayastan. And here on this plateau, sort of almost a triangle shape, is the core site of Ani. And just to orientate yourselves, we're going to see more closely in a second Ani itself, but these two images I'm going to show, one comes from the north to the south, and the other goes from the west to the east. So this is the city of Ani in all of its wonder and glory. I really love this image. And you can see here, so as I said, this is looking from north to south. This is the Republic of Armenia's territory. This is the Republic of Turkey's territory. And here you see the very famous double circuit of walls, the cathedral of Ani, the mosque of Menuchehir, the Gargikashen, which is modeled architecturally on Svartnots, the 7th century church in the One Republic of Armenia, so-called Merchant's Palace, which we'll see a bit later on, the Church of the Saviour, one of the churches built by the Bagratuni family in the 11th century, and another one of the churches built by the Bagratuni family is the Citadel, which Christina Moranci will be talking to us about next week, talking about the archaeology of Ani and its monuments. And this is the architectural site, which in the final seminar of this series, Yavuz Ozkaya will be talking to us about in terms of its presentation and preservation rather, and archaeological history. And then here it is again from west to east, the core of the site here, and the Merchant's Palace, the cathedral, the Armenian side with this unfortunately placed stone quarry. And it's important that I say that the reason why I say the core of the site is because what we should imagine, although this has become the city of Ani as such, we should imagine this as almost like a medieval French, the cité, the core walled area of the city. So that means that we need to imagine that beyond this obviously very heavily built environment, as you can see from the archaeological sites which have now been covered up, which you can see overgrown here, but you can see where the buildings were. We need to imagine it expanding out here into the rock cut architecture down here, and also across the modern border into the modern-day Republic of Armenia. There's a rather symbolically broken bridge across the Akhurian down here. All of this would have been the space of Ani as the city in its heyday. So in presenting a new story of Ani's emergence, one thing I really want to emphasize is its contingency. The fact that there was nothing inevitable about Ani's emergence, about its development, or about its end. And that's because when we have these such rarefied, such made seemingly objective, real, and outside of history narratives like Ani has become to many, there's an inevitability that comes along with that. Ani would always exist. It would always have its golden age, which necessarily means it needs its decline and its fall. And what I really want to emphasize is that Ani, there was nothing inevitable about this. It came about because of particular historical conditions, and these historical conditions required certain preconditions, and it had a development a trajectory, and an end for similarly historically dependent situations. So to begin then with this story, we'll start looking at some of these maps. So these maps are from armenica.org, which is a very useful resource, and the maps that it uses are essentially simplified versions of Robert Hewson's Historical Atlas of Armenia, published I think in 2000, if not 2000 itself, then the very early 2000s. It's a very useful map, and it's good to have these versions put online. So the first precondition for the contingent emergence of Ani is the development of the Bagratuni monarchy, the medieval kingdom of Great Armenia, Metzhaik, ruled by the Bagratuni family. And the immediate precondition for that in turn is the Khalifal province of Armenia. Now in this first map, this is shows the Khalifal province of Armenia, which stretches across what's known as historic Armenia and these regions of Caucasia and Upper Mesopotamia, and includes also historic Georgian lands and Caucasian Albania, the modern day republics then of Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Eastern Turkey. And what I really want to emphasize, as scholars like Alison Vacker have really shown, is that Armenia, including its Christian aristocracy, was an organic part of the broader caliphate, and particularly in the dates I give here are roughly the dates for the Abbasid Caliphate. The Abbasid Caliphate was a world systemic empire stretching from the Maghreb in the west across and also nominally in Spain, across into Central Asia. And Armenia was very much a part of this, including its Christian aristocracy as a provincial elite. Now, of course, there is also some unique aspects of that provincial elite, not least being that it was Christian, and that those unique aspects provided sources of tension, or as often, or maybe differently put, vehicles through which other tensions could be expressed. But nevertheless, they were fully part of the broader Khalifal world, fully integrated into the broader Khalifal world. But in 861, the Caliphate experienced a systemic crisis that's seen from Sicily to Egypt, to Armenia, and into Central Asia. And 861 kind of symbolically marks this with the murder of the Caliph al-Mutawakil. And the way that this crisis is expressed is in the increasing relative autonomy of these local provincial elites. You have the Aghlabids in Sicily, you have the Tulunids in Egypt, and you have the Bagratuni in Armenia. Already the Bagratuni in the earlier, from the 840s around that, being recognized by the Caliph as the Prince of Princes, the Batrik al-Batrik, which is the term that I adore because Batrik comes from the Roman patricios, which in turn comes from Latin patricius, so patrician, this long survival of a originally classical Roman word being given to these Armenian princes in the 9th century by the Caliph of the Islamic world. But then in the context of this breaking apart of the Caliphate and the competition between local elites and the opportunities that this afforded and the power plays that the Caliph necessarily had to enter into, they're recognized as king. Bagratuni are given this title of king. And very shortly afterwards, the Eastern Roman Emperor, so-called Byzantine Emperor, recognized them as Archon, which is a slightly moderated, but still essentially recognition as king. And of course, this doesn't mean independence at this point. There's still nominal subjection to the Caliphate. There's still the local Khalifal governor, the Vostikan. And there's also a second kingdom of the Armenians, which emerges in Vaspurakan, which we're known historically as the kingdom of Vaspurakan, but in its own time, and the Adzuruni family who ruled it, claimed the titles of kingdoms of the Armenians. But Ani is still nowhere to be seen. So Ani is not here in the province of Armenia. It's not here in the earlier 10th century. Instead, you have the great metropolis of the province of Armenia, which is really its heyday. You have Dvin. It's when it's at its largest. It's a huge city. It's minting coins. It's coins which are mimicked all the way into Scandinavia. And you also have the emirate to the here, where in Karin, or the Arabic emirate of Kalekala, which itself comes from Arabic Karni Kakaki, so the city of Karin. And you have other cities to the south, but Ani is not there. So there's a second precondition, and that is the establishment of the Bagratuni monarchy in the site of Ani. Now, the site of Ani, I should say, does have a fortress in the citadel, which Christina Moranci will be talking to us about next week. But there's no city there. There's not a broader urban site. There's from the 7th century, we can at least say there's a fortress, but the broader urban site doesn't seem to be in evidence. But what happens over the first part of the 10th century, as Tim Greenwood in St Andrews has really brilliantly shown, and in an article in Richard Hovhannisyan's collected volume, Armenian, Karin and Ani, Kars and Ani rather, is that in the early 10th century, the Bagratuni monarchy is choosing different sites, Bagaran, Shiragavan, Gars, and for purely contingent familial reasons, in the middle of the 10th century, it becomes apposite for the reigning Bagratuni to situate himself at Ani. So that's what I really mean about this contingency. That a number of these cities quite near to each other might have been the Ani, but Ani itself came about because of this moment in the 10th century. And yet there's something more going on. So here we see finally this map in 970, there's Ani here, and here we can see a plan of Ani from the mid-19th century. So this first circuit of walls, which more or less just walls off where the citadel itself is built in the middle of the 10th century, in the 950s. But within a generation after, in the 980s, there's the new, much more famous circuit of walls being built. And that covers the wider plateau. And that's an interesting fact, right? Because that indicates that something has happened within this single generation to both allow and perhaps also demand this expansion of the regulated urban space. Because as I mentioned, the urban space extends beyond just this walled area, but for some reason, the Bagratuni monarchs decided to enclose a much larger section only 30 years after, and importantly, have the financial means, have the wealth, have the material ability to construct these walls. And there's a little clue found slightly earlier in the 10th century to what's happening here. So I mentioned that there isn't sign of an urban site at Ani. That might be because the archaeology hasn't uncovered the nascent urban site yet, or that the later urban site means that those earlier occupations aren't quite there or aren't quite accessible, because in 900 you have an inscription from Sevannavank which mentions the donation to these Bagratuni built monasteries at Lake Sevan of a shop. Now, just a little brief aside, I mentioned earlier how I wanted to tell this story from the stones of Ani itself. And what I mean by this is the way in which Armenian monuments of the Middle Ages literally speak to us through their stones because of this uniquely rich tradition of medieval Armenian epigraphy. And it is very much medieval. There are some late antique Armenian pieces of epigraphy, but they're not of the same quality that you get later on. This phenomenon of plastering, if anyone's been to really any Armenian monastery from Karabakh to modern Eastern Turkey, you'll see this densely covered space, written space. And that comes about really in the 8th and 9th centuries. And I think, and I can talk more in the Q&A about this, I think this has some connection to this context again of the caliphate, and maybe some relationship too as well to the Islamic practice of vakf, of religious donations, which are also inscribed. It's not clear actually which tradition starts first, whether inscribed vakfs start and Armenian traditions are in dialogue, or the other way around. But regardless, this is a medieval phenomenon. And so this means that medieval Armenian monuments are quite literally cartularies in stones. They're archives in stone. And Sevan for Ani. And Ani itself preserves well over 300 distinct pieces of these documents. And for the majority of them are donations, as I mentioned, for this church. And that means they're legal documents, right? And there's work that you can do to compare with other seemingly preserved documents to demonstrate this too. So a shop. And a shop indicates mercantile activity, of course. And the fact that a shop is being granted to indicates the prominence of mercantile activity, indicates the profitability, because what you're doing with this grant is setting up a monastery for the foreseeable future. So in the middle of the 10th century then, it would seem that economic activity is beginning to cluster around the Bagratuni monarchy as it establishes itself in this center. And that provides then the means to expand, both the means and the necessity to expand the walled space of the city. Because very quickly, from the later 10th century, you start to have dramatic increase. All of the grand, spectacular architecture that we think of when we think of Ani, that survives much of it extant into the modern day, the Gagikashen, the cathedral. By the early 11th century, the Pahlavi churches being built almost at the rate of 1 every 10 years. This is evidence of this thriving economic sector, seemingly, and from the inscriptions you can see, based on mercantile capitalist activity. For example, in 994, Shushan Pahlavi, interestingly a female aristocrat, grants a shop owned by her to this church. To this church. And this might be related also to the relative decline of Dvin in this period. So perhaps, and this is a very big perhaps, but perhaps what you have is in Ani a relatively lighter taxed space under the Bagratuni monarchy relative to the Arabic Emirates, which Dvin still was, or Kalakala, or the Roman controlled spaces to the west, where merchants could go to be relatively more lightly taxed, but which provided a dramatic increase in wealth to the Bagratuni monarchs, but also to their aristocrats, particularly the Pahlavi, who seem almost to be merchant lords. And this is one thing that I really want to underline with this different story that I want to tell. It doesn't just create new characters for us to think with in this urban space, but it also throws those more familiar characters into a new light. And this produces the early 11th century golden age of Ani, where you have the Bagratuni monarchs disposing of large amounts of wealth, you have the Pahlavi building incredibly rapidly, and you also have in the inscriptions some figures just below, just visible, who seem to be of a more humble background. They're granting a shop, which they interestingly describe as their hayrenik, their patrimony, their patrimonial shop, to one of these religious foundations. Or they might grant one mill, one piece of economic infrastructure, one field, a few gardens, and it's a father with no surname and a son with no surname. Now, these figures are still elites in that they're disposing of wealth. They might be very humble elites, but they're still elites. But they're nowhere near on the scale of the Pahlavi, let alone of the Bagratuni monarchy. But in the middle of the 11th century, something is transformed. And this is normally, the middle of the 11th century is normally when Armenian studies has tended to lose interest in Ani as a space. Not entirely, there's a few scholars primarily interested in trade and in commerce itself that give a more full picture. And there's a handful who have looked at Ani across its trajectory. But the middle of the 11th century is often where interest in Ani drops off, to the extent that one of the articles in the Hovhannissian volume that I mentioned before talks about Ani after Ani, meaning the period after 1045, when, I mean, it's saying there are interesting things going on there, but the title is revealing, right, of what the assumption, what the common sense is. And that's the East Roman annexation. The Roman Empire the Eastern Roman Empire had been annexing parts of Upper Mesopotamia and Caucasia from the earlier 11th century, and in the middle 11th century annexes Ani. And what this does is crucial for the long-term trajectory, because I mentioned those three broad categories of elites that we can see. We can see the Bagratuni monarchs, we can see these merchant lords like the Pahlavi, and then we can see these other figures, more humble figures. And what Roman annexation does is firstly remove the Bagratuni monarchy. They're taken from Ani and settled in Cappadocia. According to Aristokes, they're forcibly married with the Arzruni family, who've been taken from Vaspurakan a generation earlier, and some kind of Armeno-Roman, Romano-Armenian spaces emerging in Cappadocia. merchant lords like the Pahlavuni. At that point, Grego Pahlavuni is the sort of patriarch of this family, according to Aristokes, of his own volition, of his own choice, goes from Buzhny, the familial seat in the modern Republic of Armenia, to Constantinople, and hands over his lands in return for estates elsewhere in the empire and imperial titles. He's known to history as Greco Magistros, imperial titles and imperial commands. So Greco Magistros, we don't know where he receives his estates, but he receives command of the imperial province of of Mesopotamia here, and of Vaspurakan here. And this seems to create an opportunity then. It seems to create a moment where those humble figures, that new character that I want to center in my story of Ani, are able to assert themselves, almost to the point that I play with this term, if you'll forgive me, of the Venice of Caucasia, a Venice sitting in the hook of the Lesser Caucasus Mountains. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is a city, mercantile, capitalist in nature, under the rule, like direct and then increasingly relatively autonomous, of the Eastern Roman Empire, where you have an oligarchic set of merchants who are arranging imperial rule to their own benefit. And we can see this indicated in two inscriptions in Ani on the cathedral. So this again is one of my own photos, and you can see where the inscription's based. As well as one very interesting section in a Roman historian written in Greek in Constantinople, Michael Italiatis. So here we see, I, Aron Magistros, bought golden bulls of liberty, so that's imperial treaties, imperial golden bulls, from the august autocrat empress, which dates this then to the middle of the 1050s, because it's reigning empress, for the relief of the poor houses of the city, and freed uninhabited houses from the tastak to the quantity of 8 liters of gold. So what that means is this Aron Magistros, who has a senatorial title, a high senatorial title, who seems to be in charge of the running of the city, he goes to the empress and asks for tax relief for the poor houses of the city, and the uninhabited houses, because of the way the Roman tax systems work, he has the tax taken off them, because this is land being taxed, not people. So if there's an uninhabited house, then the tax burden for that gets distributed to the neighbors and to the city as a whole. So what he does is get that removed to the quantity of 8 liters of gold. And then you get the really crucial part. By the request of the Ishkhanavurk, I also prevented the imposition of 2 liters of gold, which the Muhtasib used to collect. Now, these are two crucial terms, Ishkhanavur and Muhtasib. So firstly, with Ishkhanavur, this is really interesting because it clearly indicates the people who are reigning, the people who are exercising sovereignty, but it's not one of the typical terms for an aristocratic title, an aristocratic group in medieval Armenian. This would be Nakhara historically, although that drops off already by the end of the 10th century, and in the 11th century, Aristokes doesn't mention Nakhara at all. Or Azat, so meaning free man. Aristokes does use this term to denote nobles, and these, but again, it's not being used here. Or Ishkhan, again, which as Aristokes uses, also Greco Pahlavuni and his family use this at their foundation at Marmashen in the modern Republic of Armenia, which has clear architectural resonances with what's going on in Ani, also has mention of their shops and their wealth. But again, Ishkhan isn't here. So it's a desire for some term for the elite, which isn't one of these traditional aristocratic titles. And then the Muhtasib. The Muhtasib is the term in Islamic law, in Sharia law, for the official who collects the market tax and regulates the market. So what you have then are these figures, the Ishkhanavurk, who are asking the Roman governor to prevent the imposition of 2 liters of gold tax from the marketplace, i.e. these are merchant capitalists exercising their class power in order to have tax deductions. I mean, the classic thing that any capitalist would do up to our contemporary world. We're all very familiar with oligarchs seeking to avoid taxation. And this is seen again, even more interestingly, in this second inscription that I mentioned. So this is slightly later on in the early 1060s, or the very, very late 1050s, but probably the early 1060s. And it has Bagratov. So again, it's a place that he comes from. It's not a surname, who's magistros. And this time he's the Katapan of the East. So he's the general governor. He's the governor general of the region of the East, which is an interesting term in itself. It denotes a world that has its center in Constantinople. And he's going to the emperor at this point, Constantinos Dukas, to have pity, to have tax relief on the Mayrakagak, the mother city of Ani. And he says that Mukhtar, son of Kurt, who's the Hipatos, which means consul, Greco, son of Lapastak, who's the Spathauri Candidatos, and another Spathauri Candidatos, Sarkis, son of Artavaz, received the Tanuteru Tiunk. So they're the Tanuteris, the overseers. So it seems that these figures are kind of triumvirs. There's a government of the city that they're in charge of, together with this Katapan, who's generally in charge of the region. And all of them come together to free the populace from taxes, service tax, cart tax, labor tax. Here you see Anetsi traders have their levy taxes lessened. The dealers in cotton material, cotton seems to be a key product that's being produced in this area. Lots of inscriptions indicate this. The levy is half. There's other taxes on cattle and everything, which is all being reduced. And what do they do in return? They say that the Katapan, whoever he is, will give 600 modi of grain and the cost of the cavalry. So he's contributing to the stores of the citadel and the garrison of the citadel. And the Tanuterk shall make the rest of the cost, so presumably equaling the loss in revenue from taxation, from their own house or estate, which is not something heavy for Ani. So what are they saying? We're rich enough to take this on, and we can make more money. We can pay what that would have been and make more money ourselves by lessering these taxes. And I mentioned that Aliates is important for this. So he has Pankratios, who's clearly Bagrat, coming to the emperor and negotiating exactly this relative autonomy. So what you have in these only 19 years of Roman rule is seemingly an axis around which the trajectory of the city turns. The monarchy is removed, the merchant lords are removed, and these relatively humble merchants are able to reach a point where they're negotiating a relative autonomy within the broader Eastern Roman Empire, and able to profit massively to the point that they claim, although Italiati said they didn't do it very well, to be able to take over the defense of the city themselves. And of course, this doesn't last. I mentioned my title, The Fate of Unjust Cities, comes from an account of the Seljuq Turkish sack. And that creates the second moment at which Armenian study seems to drop off in its interest generally in Ani. And decline is often argued to set in, at least historically argued to set in at this point. As we'll see later, there's a relative return of interest for the early 13th century, but this is one of those key dates. And in 1064, the Seljuk sultans take it over, but then already in 1072, they sell it, which is an interesting indication of a monetary economy in itself, to the Shaddadid, Kurdish Shaddadid emirs of Ganzak. And that's interesting. And I think generally the Shaddadids are an incredibly interesting family and understudied, although they're undersourced as well, which is one of the reasons that they're relatively understudied. But I find them fascinating because they had been intermarrying with the Bagratuni for several years. Minuchehir, after whom the Minuchehir Mosque is known, it was married. One of his wives was a Bagratuni princess. He's the first figure to mint coins in Ani. The Bagratuni monarchs never mint their own coins. In Ani, you find Khalifal coinage up until about the mid to late 10th century, and then it swaps relatively quickly over to Roman coinage. So that's an interesting indication of Roman economic hegemony spreading ahead of the actual political realization of that hegemony in the mid-11th century. But they don't mint their own coins. It's the Shaddadids who mint the first coins that have Ani on it. And also it seems that they don't immediately convert the cathedral, that they respect the pre-existing population of Ani and its religious traditions. But there is an issue, admittedly, for the 12th century, and one reason why it's been understudied, and that's a dramatic drop-off in the main source that I'm using to tell this story, the epigraphy, the inscriptions. But I think it's important to underline that that doesn't mean that Ani loses its wealth. What it means is that the practice represented by the inscriptions is no longer as prominent, because the inscriptions aren't a neutral indicator of activity. They're an indicator of what wealth, how much wealth is being given to religious institutions. So it doesn't mean that merchant classes who seemingly aren't giving that much, also under the Roman period, to these foundations, aren't wealthy and aren't accumulating. All it means is that they're not yet giving to religious institutions. And one indication that you have of the prominence still of this merchant class is the inscription that I have at the bottom here. So this is from the year 1161, you can see here. It says it's in the reign of Fatlan, who's the Emir Fatlan. He's a Shaddadid who had been replaced by, who had replaced his brother, seemingly so you do have historical sources for this period. You have some Islamic, Persian and Arabic sources, historical chronicles. You also have the Georgian chronicle, the Kartlis Kovreba. And they indicate that the populace of Ani is quite dynamic in this period. And populace in these sources normally would mean the prominent figures, the elites who are able to mobilize wealth in order to affect political change. They first replaced in 1156 the Shaddadid Emir with his brother, and then later on in 1161 they replaced Fatlan with an invitation to the Georgian monarch to come, the Bagrationi monarch, to come and take Ani. So in this inscription, which is on a tower, one of those famous towers of Ani, which is called in Armenian a burg. So that's another fantastic term. It indicates that we're now in the world of the Crusades. This burg is obviously a German word, also bourge in French. It indicates this is when Baron starts to enter into Armenian. So that shows the transformed world that we're in. And he says, in the year 1161, in the reign of Fatlan, and in the patriarchate of Lord Basech, the Catholicos of the Armenian Church, I, Abraham, built this burg from my halal silver in memory of me and my parents. Let those who see it remember me and my parents and give prayers to the teacher who was sent. So there's a few things I want to pick out here. One is that Fatlan, the supposing ruler, is only given as a way of dating when this inscription is placed. He's not described in any kind of grand terms. He's not attributed the agency for building the tower. It's Abraham, who again has no surname, no title, who is given the agency for building the tower that defends Ani. Similarly, Abraham is giving it from his halal silver. Now, halal is a fantastic term that you get in Armenian inscriptions from the 9th century that denotes a very haram, a very unhalal practice, i.e. using money to make more money. When you're giving from your patrimony, from your inherited wealth, you say it's from your hayranik. But when you're giving from something where you used money to make your own money, that's when you say it's your halal silver, your halal wealth. And it's not in memory, it's not in honor of the ruler, it's in memory of him, he and his parents. And now finally, I want to pick out this final phrase, to give prayer to the teacher who was sent. Now this is interesting because there's nothing direct to say what religion Abraham is. And obviously Ibrahim is a very common Muslim name. But I would argue that in all likelihood, he is a Christian Armenian who is blurring it slightly because he's living under a Muslim emir. Because if you were Muslim, you probably wouldn't mention the patriarchate of Lord Basech. And you also would be more effusive about Allah and about Muhammad and about and you probably also wouldn't use Armenian. That's a key point, that this is written in Armenian. So the teacher who was sent, or the teaching apostle, it's Vardapet can also be Arakial can be the apostle, and Vardapet can be an adjective, yes, it's not exactly clear, but probably refers to Christ, but in this blurring term that recognizes Christ more as Isa, as the prophet of Muslim rule. So in short, I would say that this indicates that the merchant class of Ani is still predominant under the Shaddadid emirs, and that we should imagine that they continue to accumulate their wealth and to profit massively over the entirety of the 12th century. And this is indicated all the more strongly when the veil lifts in the late 12th century and the early 13th centuries, with the conquest of Ani by Zakare and Ivane, the Zakarian or Mukhargurdzeli brothers, these Armenian-Georgian brothers who are very careful and clever about how they use both Georgian Orthodox traditions and Armenian Apostolic traditions, one remaining Orthodox, one converting to Armenian Christianity. When they come in, you suddenly have more inscriptions. And there you can see a stupendous level of wealth. And I'm going to just pick one, the most famous one for you today. So this is from Tigran Honentz's donation. Tigran Honentz, who builds this famous church in the early 13th century in 1215, as you can see here. And the Merchant's Palace, which I mentioned earlier, some have proposed was Tigran Honentz's house itself. This inscription stretches along this space here. You can see I've just got two of the arches that it's carved within to show you how long it is. And I've got this translation from Manandian's classic work on trade. And here you can see the level of wealth that he's disposing of. So I just want to pick out a few things. One is the half the village of Gorokhonets that he's giving. 5 dangs, which is a measurement of wealth, of the stone quarries that are near it. Half of the village of Mushakonets, half the village of Kapkuts, the whole of the village of Chamkachov. What's being given here is the right to either a share or the whole of the monetary rents taken from these villages, which by this point in the early 13th century, a practice has developed where the merchant class of Ani is able to buy and sell and donate shares of the rents from villages. So this is a capitalized rentier economy. And that's why I put here the merchant rentiers of Ani. They're not just taking money through capital accumulation, but also through rents. And it's not only villages that they're collecting rents from. It's also these 5 dangs of the stone quarries. So all kinds of economic and material infrastructure is being monetized. Also within Ani itself, he's giving merchant infrastructure, the hostelry funduk, which is a kind of hostelry for merchants, with storage space for the commodities that they're bringing. A hostelry Khanapar, which is more of a just a straightforward hostelry without the same level of space for commodities, but it's got its shops attached. So it's almost a kind of wholesale infrastructure. Another hostelry funduk, so that's 3 he's given. Baths, stables, oil presses with 2 wheels. Even, and I just want to find it here, half the river bought by me between Bashkanap and the bridge, Beshkanakap and the bridge. So that's to say the Akhurian river itself, and presumably it's the part of the Akhurian that Tigran Honentz's church is by, because that's slightly down and nearer to the river, is commodified, is being bought and sold by Tigran Honentz. So Tigran is the most dramatic exemplar, but there are many other figures like this. And again, he has no aristocratic lineage that he's celebrating. These are relatively new men. They're merchant capitalists who seem to be, and we see this again in the same sort of story as Abraham on the walls, who seem to be more prominent within the city space than the supposed rulers. The Zakarian Mukhargurdzeli, who are under the rule then of the broader hegemony of the Georgian Bagrationi monarchs. And that's seen again on the walls, where you even have examples of towers where female elites are building towers without naming the Zakarian Mukhargurdzeli, let alone the Georgian monarchs, at all. They name it entirely in their own right. Now, this world only lasts for about 2 generations before you have what's really the final moment that most people lose interest. Georgian Studies, who's done lots of fantastic work on this early 13th century period, because of this position in the broader Georgian Pan-Caucasian Empire. There's also lots of great Armenian studies work. Sergio Laporta has done work on how the Zakarian Mukhargurdzelis are playing with discourses of Armenianness and recreating Armenia. But by 1239, you have a real drop-off in interest. And that's because of the world-shattering conquests of the Mongols. The Mongol Empire comes directly into Ani. There's a sack of Ani, and it's common. Some would still say that the decline of Ani begins at this point. And of course, there is destruction. There are difficulties for lots of people. But I want to make a really strong argument that even this moment provided an opportunity to these merchant rentiers, provided an opportunity to these capitalists for their accumulation. And again, it's the inscriptions that reveal the story. So these inscriptions come from the Hormos monastery, which is about 40 kilometers to the northwest. I'm forgetting my map exactly in my head, of Ani, and has a really direct relationship with the city. It seems that when the city itself is no longer thriving, that the Catholicosate moves to Hormos. And there's a fantastic volume on it that's been recently published that has all of these inscriptions in translation. And they reveal a really interesting story. So you have here, I'm going to start with this one. Char, son of Paron, master Umek. Umek is known from other histories to have traveled himself to the Mongol Khans to get special status and tax relief for his activities. Grandson of Char from Manaskert, at the time of the rule of the world from Karanuin, and in the reign of in Georgia of the Bagratid Dimitri, bought Getik. So Getik was bought by his father Umek for 40,000 gold ducats. So that's these East Roman coins, and 40,000 is a stupendous level of wealth. And he's buying a village, buying the rights to this entire village. And he himself, Char, bought Hovk, another village, for 4,000. So that's a dramatic reduction, a 100-fold reduction in price, to 4,000 gold ducats during hard times when land was cheap and gold was dear. Now, what was this time? This time seemed to be when Mongol rule was being imposed, when particularly taxation was being imposed, as I'll come back to at the end. And these merchant capitalists who are cash rich are able to take advantage of this and able to accumulate on that basis. And you see here in this inscription from 1261, in the time of the rule over the world of Hulagu Khan, Sahmadin, the son of Avatik, bought the royal palace of Mren from Artashir, the son of Shahanshah. So it's important to say that the Zakarian Mukhrar-Gurdzeli family continue to rule all the way into the later 13th century under the rule of the Mongols, but in a dramatically reduced state, to the point where these capitalists are buying their own royal infrastructure from them for their own families. So he says that he bought those vineyards and gardens called Arkayuchun, the royal palace, and he then laid the foundations and had it renovated himself, paying 40,000 gold ducats again. And just finally here you see an inscription in the name of a Taik Taguhi, so a woman, who is giving to Hormos a grindstone. So this is economic infrastructure, which her son had redeemed from pawn. So this is people who are going into debt, again, probably in the context of this transition to Mongol rule and taxation, which I'll come back to. And they're able, with their money, by this point, interestingly, spitak, so that's this silver coinage, which is Ilkhanate. And here you have an example of a trapezuntine coin, a Trebizond coin, which has East Roman motifs, like you see here, but minted on an Ilkhanate silver standard. He's using 700 of these to redeem mortgaged property and then granting it to Hormos. So Mongol rule provided opportunities, but it has to be said that by the 13th century, 14th century rather, something does seem to change drastically. Ani is no longer in evidence. In the later 14th century, some of the local Turkmen dynasties do seem to use Ani. Some coins that don't seem to circulate very far, but they are being, they are there. and there's some kind of center for Timur-Lenk, but my protagonist for this story, the merchant class, is no longer in evidence. The buildings, there's no new constructions, there doesn't even seem to be renovations taking place. So something has changed. And at this moment, I want to take a step back and look regionally and globally at just how unique the dramatic urbanization of Ani might appear to be. Because the short story is, it's not. It's actually emblematic of not just a regional, but a global story taking place at these years. So first regionally, we can see Artanuj in the modern Republic of Turkey, but in historical Tau or Taik, in the early 10th century, seems to be taking off as a merchant center. You have this evidence particularly through a Greek palace text known as the Administrando Imperio, which talks about the wealth that's coming there from all parts of the world. And it would seem to be that wealth from Artanuj that provides the basis for those beautiful churches in historic Tau Taik, built, for example, by David Kuropalates in the late 10th century in modern Artvin province. Also nearby to Ani, you have Artsin, which is where Aristakez comes from. Artsin probably meaning, coming from the Arabic Artun, meaning fields. The Artun Arum, so the fields of the Romans, which becomes Artsin or Erzurum eventually. And this city develops incredibly quickly. In the later 10th century, after the Roman conquest of Karin and the destruction of its city walls, and they move over to this other site that seemed to be primarily just a small marketplace before. And in Ataliates, who I mentioned earlier, in Aristakez, you have this celebration of Artsin in the same terms as Ani, as a place of where you can hear all the languages of the world. You can hear Assyrians, you can hear Armenians, you can see objects from India, you can see all things and all people from all places. So again, a commercial merchant capitalist city in a really quite small area, and those aren't even all of the centers, obviously Kars, and you have other centers as well. You have Trebizond here, and even Tvin is still strong. Tbilisi, you have lots of different centers. And then if we look globally, Cairo, founded in the 10th century under the Fatimids, takes off at exactly the same time. You have Zeytun, Choncho in China. You have the more familiar merchant capitalist cities of Belgium, Troyes and Bruges, and the takeoff in that part of far west Eurasia. So Ani isn't unique, in fact. It speaks to a global story, and this global story is the Afro-Eurasian commercial revolution, or revolutions, however you would prefer to frame it, because these are both general and interlocking particular phenomena, that takes place from the 9th century. And I'd be happy to go into this in a lot more detail in the questions if people want to ask about them. But the short explanation for how this takes off is that what you have in the 9th century, from the early 9th century, is a coincidence of large tax-based empires taxing entirely in coin. Of course, you'd had lots of tax-based empires before, and coin had been used for taxation. But in the early 9th century, in the Abbasid Empire, from Spain across into Central Asia, in the Eastern Roman Empire, in the Tang Empire, you have huge world systemic imperial systems, particularly the Caliphate, that are demanding taxation in coin. And what does taxation in coin drive? If you're a subaltern producer and you want to, and I want grain from you, then you can just grow your produce and give me grain. It's going to change what you're going to have to do to survive. You might grow so much grain that you have an incredibly unbalanced diet and your bones are weak and all the rest of it, but you only have to grow grain. But if you need to give me a gold coin or a fraction of a gold coin, then you need to do something else with your produce. You need to sell it, or you need to take a loan from a merchant. A merchant might offer you a loan and in return guarantee all of your crop goes to him. He might say that you should start to grow cotton, or you can mortgage your property. All of these are drives that start to come into place when taxation happens in coin. And this coincidence of taxation across Afro-Eurasia drives these roots that we see. And the commercial revolution is more familiarly seen in the latecomer, relative latecomer, both to taxation in coin and to the commercial revolution, i.e. Europe or far west Eurasia, but seen incredibly richly in the Cairo-Geniza, in the Tang Empire, even in South Asia, and really across this space. And if you look here on this part, you begin to see where Ani, Artsin, Artanuji, Tabriz, and all these other regional centers are based. And if you look at this map and compare it with this one, it begins to look like the Mongol Pan-Eurasian Empire is a political realization of the Afro-Eurasian commercial revolutions, what Janet Abu-Lughod calls the world system before European hegemony. And this Mongol Empire is central to the later story of Ani. Of course, we saw those inscriptions in the time of Hulagu, of Karanuin, and Armenian sources are incredibly important for Mongol history. Some of the best work is done there. And what the Mongols were incredibly effective at was taxation. Our image of the Mongol Empire is of one of destruction, destroying agriculture, destroying cities, sacking Baghdad, and really the antithesis of state civilization in some sense. But they were in fact masters of that key feature, that sine qua non of state civilization, tax. And you have this clearly in the Armenian records. Those pressures where where land was cheap and gold was dear, that was because of a series of censuses across the 1050s, across the late 1050s, where Persian administrators coming under the rule of the Mongols were registering not just land this time, but the people themselves, their activities, their professions, their properties, and accumulating tax burdens on them, which drove this moment that allowed the capital consolidation, which the merchants of Ani had. And in this dynamic, in this interplay between the taxation and capital accumulation, we have maybe a new explanation, a contingent historical explanation for Ani's decline. And that's seen indicatively in one of the final inscriptions of Ani, a Persian inscription from the Mosque of Minuchihir, which is recorded earlier in the 20th century, which is difficult to find today. And it comes from the last great Ilkhan, so the Iranian and eventually Islamic successors to the Mongol Empire in Caucasia and on the Iranian plateau. And by this point, Ani has been named a Khasinju, a personal property of the Ilkhan. And that seems to be because they're trying to accumulate wealth from Ani because it had been so productive of tax in a context where the Ilkhanate is experiencing its own political and economic crisis, because that world system is not just breaking down in Ani, but it's breaking down worldwide in the early 14th century. It's dislocating. And this is seen interestingly in an attempt to introduce paper money in the Ilkhanate, which is recorded in Armenian histories. And this paper money we have described apparently included both Chinese characters and the Islamic profession of faith. And it was modeled on what Kublai Khan and the Mongols in China were introducing. But it didn't work in the Ilkhanate. It caused chaos and it wasn't an effective way of doing it. And so what this inscription says is that no other tax should be taken apart from the tamgu, the head tax, and the lawful customs duty, commercial tax. From each man, let nothing be demanded as tax for any of the others, as was done with Ani and the other cities of the province of Georgia, i.e. the cities taken from the Georgian kingdom, which had been collected with unlawful adscriptions and force that had been used. And this is because the place had started to become deserted. Men from among the common people, those people who had had to mortgage so much and who the merchant capitalists could accumulate from, had begun to scatter. They had exercised maybe the most august and honorable form of resistance, and they had run away. And the elders of the city, the capitalists, and of the province had left. They abandoned their real and movable provinces, possessions, which is probably hyperbolic, but they had left their fixed property and they went away. And interestingly, we have one story of Armenian merchant capitalists going from Ani into Crimea and choosing then to reproduce themselves as capitalists at that point in different locations. At the same time, in 1319, we have one of the last Armenian inscriptions, the last one from the walls of Ani, a mention of a Greco Agha, which is the only time that this title is mentioned in one of Ani's inscriptions. And what Agha indicates is a landlord. So what those two things indicate to me is that those who had been the merchant rentiers of Ani reached a choice. They reached a bifurcation and this position of crisis. Do they leave, go to Crimea, Trabzon, elsewhere, and reproduce themselves as merchant capitalists and continue their trajectory into capitalist modernity and contribute to the long-term history of the Armenian merchant bourgeoisie, which is so key to that creation of a capitalist modernity? Or do they stay in their villages and become part of this Agha class, which is so central to the early modern and modern history of the region, well into the 20th century, eventually mostly ethnicized as Kurds, as Turks, but this Agha rentier class comes out of this bifurcation. So that's the new, more global and slightly different story of Ani in the medieval period that I'd like to share with you today. And I really look forward to hearing the rest of the speakers in our series, and thank you so much for listening. I really look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Nick. It feels like we went all the way to Ani, traveled in time, in place, and came back. So much detail, so interestingly and excitingly presented. Thank you very much. I'm sure there are a lot of questions, and I think you have a question in the chat if you want to read an answer. If you want to ask a question as well, you can raise your blue digital hand as well, so Nick can see. I invite you to ask.
So I can see a question from Albert about what's new, and I'm going to actually pause on that and invite you to attend the last session in the seminar series, because I'm really not the expert for the most recent archaeological finds. Yavuzuzkaya will be able to answer that brilliantly in his presentation. Will really speak to that new research that's being done on the site of Ani. But I can see Olivia, my colleague Olivia's question. As a sound expert, I can answer that. So when I visited it, one of the beautiful things about Ani when I visited it, so I rented a car from Kars and drove out there, and it was just the experience of driving out there, the silence out on this bit that's almost like the steppe. You can really see why it was so opposite to people who'd lived on the steppe, and you see Kurdish nomads there today, or Yazidi nomads there today, and it was really just silent and the wind. And when I got to Ani itself, again, just silence and the wind and a few birds, and at one point as well, my own moaning because I'd realized when my phone vibrated and a little noise went off that when I was looking at Tigran Honensis church, it had logged on to an Armenian phone network and suddenly charged me an extra £20 on top of my charges. And I'd been looking at using Google Maps. Yeah, that sound in itself shows really this liminal space and the fact that Ani should be able to be accessible from both sides, and unfortunately isn't. But yeah, silence and wind and my own sighs of pleasure are the sounds that I can really, yeah. really much with you. So Federico, it's great to have you here too. There's two curiosities you asked. You say the capitalist class of merchants seems to be quite different from the traditional Nakhara class, as is known, but there seems to be little interaction between the two and have different interests. So is this what sources suggest? And the second question about the quasi-mythical transposition of the Ani merchant class to Kaffa. And is this an attempt to create an own non-Nakhara related narrative? So I'll start with the second one. Yes, this quasi-mythical movement, it's been reified, it's been made objective, and the only explanation is if the entire merchant class of Ani went to Kaffa, went to the Crimea, and I wouldn't argue that, certainly. But I do think it's indicative of what the merchant class would do, because you do have a choice. A class, when I say class here, I mean it in a very strict sense. It's how you reproduce yourself as a person. If you reproduce yourself as an agrarian producer, you're a member of that particular class. If you reproduce yourself through having to use money to make more money, whether that's as a financier, a rentier, a merchant, that's how I would define those classes, or the traditional lords who are reproducing themselves through their patrimonies, and this will connect to your other question. And I think that's indicative of what you would have to do as a merchant to reproduce yourself. You have to move. Capital's inherent drive is to move, is to scour the earth, is to find new ways in which to accumulate. And so I wouldn't say that they all go to Kaffa. There's plenty of other places. It's much easier to go to Tabriz, to go to Trabzon, to go to Tbilisi. There's lots of different places that they could go. But I think it's indicative and suggestive that there is that story and that there is some historical memory of that. But no, I wouldn't want to say that they all go there in that way that it's been said traditionally. And in terms of the little interaction and different interests, I wouldn't say that there's nothing to indicate that they are in direct conflict. This traditional aristocratic, we refer to as Nakhara class, but really, as I said, that it's difficult to use that term by the late 10th and the 11th centuries. And the merchants who do seem to appear. There's a colophon in the mid-10th century by a merchant, so there's the emergence of this class. I wouldn't say that they are opposed. In fact, I would say that there's a way in which the elite class in general is learning to reproduce itself by elite, I mean those who are profiting, who are able to work from others' work, to reproduce themselves from others' work. In general are using capital to accumulate, and that's what the Bhagavatuni indicate. What I think is that because those local, more humble elites in the early 11th century remain in Ani after Roman annexation, there's an opportunity for them to reach a level of wealth and power that they wouldn't have had and didn't have earlier in the 11th century. So that's to say there's nothing to indicate a conflict or different interests. But what is interesting is that Aristakes himself doesn't seem very. He has a mixed attitude towards the merchant class, which might be just because of the traditional relationship between the Armenian church and the aristocratic classes. And he does describe. He says that at one point the merchants of Artsin had been like the princes, and that they had endowed churches and that they had done this, that, and the other. But he does seem to have a general preference. But that's not to say that there's a conflict. So I think Ireni Giviashvili has a question. I would love to hear from you, Ireni.
Okay, thank you very much. So I was unmuted. Thank you, Nick, for this brilliant talk. There is no question, actually. I wanted to develop your approach. I'm sure you know this is inscription. It's on this Georgian church, which is ruined nowadays, but this inscription was published by Nikolai Marr, and this is the inscription dated to the early 13th century, and it also proves that Ani was a very commercial city, because even the priests are very much, how to say, profit oriented. And this inscription, actually, the Georgian episcopos regulates the taxes which are taken by priests. So even the priests are very much commercial in Ani, which is unusual inscription to have such an information written on the entire wall of the church, and with the numbers and prices and etc. So wonderful talk, and thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much for that, Iranian. It's really great to see you. Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, that's a really wonderful inscription in itself. There's so many inscriptions that for 1 hour and to do all of this, it wouldn't be possible. But thank you for the opportunity to talk about it, because it's one of the few inscriptions where you get to see, as you say, the activity of the priests themselves in regulating this accumulation. Because the implication of the donations to churches of shops is that then these religious institutions are operating the shops, are using the shops, and are renting them to merchants, or perhaps even operating their own merchants, as this inscription indicates. And it is exactly one of those practices, those kinds of practices that that Aristakes points to when he talks about the fate of unjust cities, that even the priests are mercantile, are exploiting, and it's used through the very rich biblical discourse that has a go at you expropriating land for rents and things like this. And so it's really fantastic to be able to see in that, and seemingly a practice that continues over the centuries, and again bridges that 12th century gap where we have very little between the Bagratuni and Roman periods and the later Zakarian Mukhar-Gurdzeli Bagrationi period. So yes, thank you. That's a really wonderful reminder of that piece. And I think so. I see, Yavuz, you've also put something into the chat here. So thank you for the really kind words. And you say how Nikolai Marr and his team who first revealed these secrets on the walls and their own feelings and the audience there. I think one thing that's very interesting is that Nikolai Marr actually does point to this commercial quality in Ani. When I say it's a slightly new story, I don't want to overstate my case, that these aren't features of the city that are completely unknown. Nikolai Marr really talks about it, and in the context of his writings in the early USSR, thinking with a Marxist, a very orthodox but nevertheless a sort of Marxist framework. He talks about a merchant capitalism going on here, and relates this activity to the inscriptions. I think the interesting thing is that this hasn't become, although it's something that's not completely new, this hasn't become the predominant way in which most of the fields and most of the scholars who are working on Ani have talked about the space. This image of the Bagratuni city has kind of over-determined the evidence in some way, and I think that's indicated by some of the accounts we have of the digs that take place, which you again know much more about than myself, but I understand that there are accounts that talk about the wonder of the workmen who are being used in these digs, the primarily Armenian peasant workmen nearby, at seeing this connection to their heritage. And I think that's an important thing I want to underline. It's very understandable why why that narrative has come about, because it really speaks to a spectacular site of Armenian, also regional, also global, but especially Armenian heritage, that illustrates the dynamism of this region in the face of how to say it, assumptions about the East, so-called. So from what little I know, and I think you know Ma's writings and the accounts of those digs much more, but it was wonder and amazement at the richness of what they were finding.
Well, we're waiting for probably one last question. Nick, do you want to say a few words about next session as well and what it will cover? So I hope people come back for more. It's been so good. We want to know more now.
Yes. So as I said, the series is 4 parts, and let me just make sure that I get all the dates right. The next will be by Cristina Maranzi on the archaeology of Ani, and particularly on the citadel. So the site that is transferred from that original fortress through the Bagratuni and the Roman period and the Shaddadids and all the rest of it. So you should really join us for that. It's called The View from the Top, the Citadel of Ani and its Monuments. And that is exactly a week today, Thursday, 8th of July, at the same time. Then on July 15th, so that's 2 weeks today, we'll be joined by Hegnar Wattenborg, who will be speaking about how Ani has been represented. So I indicated a little bit of that at the beginning of my talk about how Ani has been imagined, how it's been the imagery that's been used for it, both near and far, both in time and place. And then finally on July 27th. So note that there'll be a week break after Hegnar's talk. And then on July 27th, on the Tuesday, we'll be hearing from Yavuzovskaya, who is at Kemikide, the Association for the Protection of Cultural Heritage, who will be talking about a unique site with great challenges, the historic preservation projects of prominent structures in Ani since 2006. So that will really end us on the site as it is today, and on the challenges and the different projects that are looking after the site today. And that should really launch us for the longer term work that we want to do with our friends at Kemikide here at AI, and also with as many of you who are here on this call as would like to participate in this network. We really want a transnational network to energize, to build on the work of Osman Bey, and to really assert the importance of Ani for all of the region's peoples, and the importance of preserving it against the real risks that it faces. So Yavuz will perfectly set us up for that work, and really hope that you can all join us for that. And I think on that, Garo asks, maybe the most important question, which is where now for Ani, how open is it for study? Anyone can visit Ani. And the inscriptions are published. They were published in old Soviet collections, and the monuments themselves can be visited and studied. Obviously, negotiating permission is much more difficult and has lots of political things back and forth that go into that I won't go into here. But I think the important thing, and what we want to do with this series and with this network, and hopefully with an eventual platform that we might be able to found off the back of this work, is to say that the study of Ani and the celebration of this site should not be dependent on the vagaries of the Turkish state and its offices and the way in which access is currently run. We can create a world in which the pressure is such that Ani becomes a site open for all to study. And that's a situation that's been created by the work of some very brave scholars in Turkey and very brave organizations in Turkey, people like Osman Bey, and a network of scholars worldwide. So I hope that wasn't too much of a hedged answer, but yes, that was it. Oh, and maybe there's time for just this one last question. So Karin Grigorian about the migration from Ani to Julfa in present-day Nakhchivan. So that's really very interesting. I hadn't heard this story of a migration from Ani to Julfa, and then of course the attempted relocation by Shah Abbas of Julfa to New Julfa in Isfahan. But that would really speak to the final points that I was making in my talk, that the story of Ani's merchant class is a part of this long-term history of the Armenian merchant bourgeoisie, which is so key to all of the emergence of modernity. So I wouldn't know when exactly that would be. I would guess that the move to Nakhchivan would be sometime in the late 13th, early 14th centuries, and then of course in the late 16th century for New Julfa. But yes, thank you so much for that, and thank you so much for coming, because that's it's really exciting to hear those kinds of family traditions, which often have a lot more to them than they're given credit for.
I think we should stop now here, very reluctantly. I'm so glad, Nick, you programmed the event video as well with yourself as a program manager. And I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I did and learned so much. I'm glad I'm working with you and I can ask all my questions next week. So thank you very much. So looking forward to the next events. It's just wonderful to connect with all the scholars from all over the world through Zoom and talk about this. And of course, for many of our viewers and myself too, it's very emotional as well to hear about the place our families come from. My family comes from somewhere between Ani and Kars, and I look at these images and think this is where my ancestors have been. So there is a lot of emotional connection, not only academic interest to this. Thanks to everyone for being here. I link to our website. Please go to our website for a lot of podcasts, read our magazine, go and look at our support page, because events like this are possible thanks to your donations and financial support. And we have a lot of new and interesting ways how you can get involved with us. You can adopt one of our bookshelves if you have books about Ani that interest you. Email us. You can sponsor our series of podcasts. And we hope also, Nick, that this series will also produce some digital outputs which can be used and read and listened after that. So thank you very much. Thanks to everyone who filled in the feedback form as well. Your opinions are very valued, and have a nice day and evening wherever you are, and hopefully see you next week, the same place, the same time. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.